Phil Dobson here, author of The Brain Book and founder of Brain Workshops. In this video I want to help you get better at generating ideas, or better at brainstorming. So first, if you haven't already seen the video I've made on reframing problems, watch that first. I think all too often we jump to this stage, the brainstorming stage, before we've really got clarity on the problem we're trying to solve. So if you haven't watched that video, do that now, because that will help you challenge your assumptions and get better clarity on what the problem is you're trying to solve. Right, now brainstorming, how do you get better at it? Well, I think there are some quick wins. So number one, give it more time. I think creativity follows a process, and consequently brainstorms often benefit with having more time than often they're given. And another quick win, I think, is just to collaborate, right? The more people you have contributing ideas, the more different perspectives you're likely to get. But the real key, I think, and that word perspective leads us towards this, is to shift your perspective, or in particular to shift your perceptual position. I think that provides the real key to kind of forcing your brain into a more lateral state. So what do I mean by shifting your perspective or your perceptual position? Well, the simplest way you could do it would be to go for a walk. Stanford researchers found that when people go for a walk, they tend to come up with 50% more ideas when they do an alternate uses test. An alternate uses test is a classic test of creativity, and it basically involves you answering the question, how many different ways can you think of to use X, a paperclip or a brick? So that exercise itself gives you some insights when you think about divergent thinking. But to shift your perceptual position and consequently become far more lateral, what I'm really talking about is seeing the challenge through the eyes of someone else. This is really important. You've probably heard of thinking hats. Edward de Bono was the guy that coined the term lateral thinking, and he has a technique that pretty much through putting on different hats, a red hat, a black hat, a white hat, what it does is it invites you to see the problem through a different lens. So for example, thinking about your problem now, what would the solution look like if you were an optimist? What would the solution look like if you were a pessimist? How might it look different if you were solely looking at the data and the evidence? You see what you're doing? You're kind of engaging in a counterfactual mindset, thinking less in terms of what is, but more in terms of what might be. And that, I believe, is a really critical skill if you want to be more creative. A technique I will often do on leadership teams, senior leaders who want to explore their strategy, is called the Disney technique, and it's a very similar idea. What would your ideal future look like if you were a dreamer? If you had all the resources in the world? This enables them to become a bit more resourceful. Then, okay, well, what would that look like if you were a realist, if you had to be pragmatic and strategic? Great. Now, what would that look like through the eyes of a critic if you suddenly became hyper aware of things that could go wrong? Now, if you oscillate between these three perceptual positions, the capacity to dream big, the capacity to be strategic, and the capacity to think what could go wrong, you can see how suddenly you become more resourceful, because ultimately you are thinking in terms of different people. And that, I believe, is the real key to divergent thinking, to brainstorming, and to becoming more lateral. It's to become ever better at deliberately shifting your perceptual position to think, what if? What would this problem look like through, I don't know, from my team's perspective, from my manager's perspective, through another stakeholder's perspective? What would my ideal customer think about this? You see what's happening? The more you do that, the more you engage in a different sort of framework perhaps, and the more you do that, the more your naturally creative brain becomes your ally. So, top tips, like I say, the next time you do a brainstorm, first make sure you've reframed the problem. Before you do a brainstorm, do a question storm, just to make sure you really understand the problem you're working on. But once you've done that, then yes, give it more time, work with other people and collaborate, but specifically, engage in different perceptual positions. Examine the problem through different lenses, through the eyes or the shoes of someone else, and I can guarantee that you'll get fresh perspectives on your problem.